Daniel had always thought of the lake as a place immune to drama. Out there, with nothing but the soft lap of water against the dock and the distant cry of loons echoing across the trees, he could breathe in a way he couldn't anywhere else. His grandfather used to call it their kingdom of quiet, a phrase Daniel had laughed at as a boy but carried with reverence as an adult. The deed was just paper, ink on a page, but to him it was proof that what he felt in his bones was real. This lake belonged to him, as much as he belonged to it. Which is why Claire Donovan's appearance on that evening still rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He hadn't expected anyone, least of all a stranger who thought she could order him off his own dock like he was trespassing. Even after showing her the deed, even after making it plain, she had stared at him with disbelief that bordered on insult, as though he were lying just to humiliate her. The memory gnawed at him long after she stormed away that night, her boots stomping against the shoreline like she wanted the earth itself to know she was angry. He could still hear her voice in his head, "You can't possibly own an entire lake." That incredulous tone, that edge of arrogance, like he was some backwoods fool trying to play landlord of the wilderness. The next morning, Daniel stood at his cabin window sipping coffee, watching mist roll low across the water. He told himself he wouldn't think about her again. She was just some vacationer, one of those city transplants who bought cabins with money earned far away, expecting to find an escape without learning the first thing about the land they set foot on. She'd realize soon enough that the lake wasn't hers to claim and move on. But when he walked down to the dock that afternoon, rod in hand, there she was again. Claire sat cross-legged at the far end of the dock, a book in her lap, sunglasses shielding her eyes. The brazen audacity of it stopped Daniel cold. He tightened his grip on the rod, debating whether to march back up the hill and ignore her, but then she spoke without even looking up. "You know," she said, her tone maddeningly casual, "you could at least consider being a decent neighbor." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're on my dock. Your lake, your kingdom. Yes, I've heard the sermon." She lifted her eyes to his, cool and unbothered. "But I didn't move here to be treated like a criminal every time I sit near the water. Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" He set the rod down, walked forward, and planted himself a few feet from her. "What's ridiculous is you acting like the rules don't apply to you. That dock, this shoreline, that water, it's all hard land. My family's. You don't get to wander down here and pretend otherwise." For a moment, something flickered in her expression, hesitation, maybe even guilt, but it hardened quickly. "Fine, then maybe I'll build my own dock. Right next to yours." Daniel barked a short, humorless laugh. "On your side of the property line. Go ahead, but don't you dare hammer a single board into my shoreline." Her lips pressed together, as if she wanted to snap back but didn't have the words. She shut her book, stood, and brushed off her jeans. "You know, you're not exactly winning points with the new neighbors." "I'm not looking to win points," he said flatly. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the frogs croak and the wind rustle the trees, restless with irritation. Claire was wrong, of course, legally, factually wrong. But it wasn't just her ignorance that kept him tossing. It was her fire. The way she'd stood there, refusing to back down even when she knew she'd lost the argument. Stubborn, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to throw his own certainty back in. His face, he hated it, and he hated that he respected it, too. The days that followed did nothing to ease the tension. If anything, the battle lines deepened. One morning, Daniel woke to find a bright red sign staked just beyond her cabin. In bold black letters it read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." The arrow pointed straight toward his dock. He almost tore it out on the spot but restrained himself, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Instead, he marched into town, pulled the property maps from the county clerk's dusty files, and made a copy to keep on hand. He wanted the evidence ready when the next confrontation came. And it did, sooner than expected. Late one afternoon, Daniel spotted movement on the water. He stepped out onto his dock just as Claire's kayak glided into view. She was paddling with steady, determined strokes, her ponytail bouncing behind her as if she had every right to cut across his lake. "Unbelievable," Daniel muttered under his breath. He cupped his hands to his mouth and called out, "Hey! You're trespassing." Claire turned her head, smirking. "I'm not touching your precious dock, am I?" "You're on my water," he shot back. "Can't own water," she said, her tone sing-song. Daniel stomped to the edge of the dock, holding up the folded map. "Actually, I can. Want me to read you the legal description, line by line?" She laughed, a full-bodied sound that carried across the lake. "Do you hear yourself? You sound insane." Frustration boiled in him. "What's insane is you barging into a place you don't belong. You don't get to rewrite boundaries just because you don't like them." She rested her paddle across the kayak, floating lazily in the current. "Maybe I just don't like boundaries. Ever think of that?" Daniel stared at her, words caught in his throat. There was something in her voice, not arrogance this time, but weariness. A tired edge that suggested this wasn't about maps and property lines. He wanted to press, to ask what she meant, but before he could, she dipped her paddle back into the water and steered away, leaving ripples in her wake. That evening, as he sat on his porch, Daniel found himself wondering about her. Who was Claire Donovan, really? Why had she bought that cabin? Why was she so hell-bent on claiming space that wasn't hers? She had money, that much was clear. Her SUV parked by the cabin wasn't cheap, but she also had a restlessness about her, a hunger that didn't fit the picture of someone seeking a simple vacation. The next day proved she wasn't done fighting. She marched up his hill, bold as ever, and knocked on his cabin door. Daniel opened it with a frown. "What now?" She crossed her arms. "We need to talk. About you trespassing, about us not killing each other before summer ends." He blinked, surprised by her bluntness. "Look," she said, softening slightly. "I didn't know when I bought that cabin that the lake wasn't part of it. Nobody told me. I assumed. And yes, maybe I've been difficult. But I'm not leaving. This is my retreat now. So either we find a way to coexist, or we keep screaming at each other until one of us loses our voice." Daniel studied her, arms braced against the doorframe. She was infuriating, yes, but she was also right. The lake wasn't big enough to keep their lives from colliding. And some part of him, though he wouldn't admit it, didn't want her gone. "You're asking me to let you break the rules," he said carefully. "I'm asking you to bend," she countered. "Just enough so we're not at war." Silence stretched between them, taut and uneasy. Finally, Daniel sighed. "I'll think about it." Claire nodded, her expression unreadable, and turned to leave. As he watched her walk down the hill, Daniel realized something unsettling. The war between them wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pride, about two people too stubborn to yield. And though he didn't know it yet, the battle had only just begun. The days that followed their uneasy truce were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Daniel tried to lose himself in his routine, mornings fixing things around the cabin, afternoons fishing or chopping wood, evenings with a book in hand while the crickets sang. But no matter how hard he tried, Claire lingered at the edges of his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He would catch glimpses of her from his dock, walking the shoreline in a hoodie, carrying groceries from her car, or sitting on her porch with a mug of coffee as if she were trying to drink in the view he still considered his. Sometimes, she pretended not to notice him. Other times, she would wave, a sly half-smile playing on her lips as though she was daring him to admit he didn't mind her being there anymore. It drove him crazy, that smile, because part of him didn't mind. The air grew heavier as August settled in, thick with the kind of heat that warned of storms. Dark clouds gathered in the distance during the afternoons, drifting like bruises across the sky, though most of the time they broke apart before reaching the valley. But each day the stillness grew sharper, like the world was holding its breath. Daniel knew the lake's moods, and the lake was restless. It was a Friday evening when the storm finally came. He had been on the dock, packing up his tackle box, when the wind shifted, sudden and sharp, carrying with it the smell of rain. The trees rattled, the first drops pattered against the wood, and thunder rumbled from the hills like a warning. He cursed under his breath and hurried toward the cabin. Then he saw her. Claire's bright red kayak bobbed on the lake, a speck against the growing chop of water. At first, he thought she was heading back, but the wind caught her paddle, spinning the kayak sideways. She fought to correct it, but the waves were building too quickly, driven by gusts that pushed her farther from shore. Lightning cracked across the sky, the sound splitting seconds later in a boom that made his chest vibrate. "Damn it, Claire," Daniel muttered. There wasn't time to think. He tore off his flannel shirt, kicked away his boots, and ran down the dock. The water was black and cold as he dove in, shocking his body with its chill. He came up gasping, pushing wet hair from his face, and struck out toward her with long, steady strokes. The kayak tipped once, twice, and then flipped completely. Claire's scream tore through the roar of the storm before it was swallowed by the water. Daniel's heart lurched. He swam harder, lungs burning, until he reached the overturned boat. Claire surfaced a few feet away, sputtering, clinging desperately to the slick hull. "Hold on," Daniel shouted, but the wind snatched his voice. He pushed closer until he could grab her arm. She was shaking, her eyes wide with panic, her breath ragged as the waves slapped against them. I can't," she choked out. "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "You're not letting go. Do you hear me?" She nodded weakly, though her grip on the kayak was slipping. Daniel wrapped one arm around her shoulders and kicked hard, dragging them both toward the nearest stretch of shore. It was slow, grueling work. The waves pulled at them, dragging them sideways, but he kept his head down, focusing only on the rhythm of his strokes and the weight of her trembling against him. By the time they reached the rocky shallows, his muscles screamed with exhaustion. He hauled her onto the sand, both of them collapsing in the mud as rain pelted down in sheets. Claire coughed violently, rolling onto her side, her hair plastered to her face. Daniel lay beside her, chest heaving, the storm raging above them. When she finally turned her head toward him, her eyes glistened with something he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but also a softness that unsettled him more than her anger ever had. You saved me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel swallowed hard, pushing wet hair from his forehead. "Couldn't just let you drown." He forced a crooked smile. "Even if you did try to evict me from my own lake." To his surprise, she laughed. It was small and shaky at first, then fuller, warmer, spilling into the storm like a crack of sunlight breaking through clouds. He found himself laughing, too, breathless and exhausted but suddenly lighter than he'd felt in weeks. They sat there for a while, drenched and shivering, until the thunder softened and the rain eased to a steady drizzle. Daniel helped her to her feet, steadying her when she stumbled, and together they walked up the hill toward his cabin. Inside, he wrapped her in a blanket and lit the fire, the flames snapping hungrily at the damp wood. Claire curled up in the armchair, clutching a steaming mug of tea he pressed into her hands. Her lips were pale, her fingers trembling as she lifted the cup, but her eyes never left him. "You didn't have to risk yourself like that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Why?" Daniel stared at the fire, the shadows flickering across the walls. He didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was duty, maybe it was something deeper he hadn't wanted to admit. "Because you're my neighbor," he said finally. "Because I couldn't just watch." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I thought you were just some stubborn man clinging to rules and property lines. But you're more than that." He met her gaze, surprised by the honesty in her voice. "And I thought you were just some entitled city girl who didn't respect boundaries." She smirked faintly. "Well, I am stubborn. So am I," he said with a grin. The storm outside faded into a soft patter, the tension between them shifting into something else entirely. Something fragile, unspoken, but undeniable. The lake was still his, the deed still in his name, but in that moment, it no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a bridge. Later, after she left for her own cabin, Daniel sat by the fire alone, replaying the evening in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of her clinging to the kayak, couldn't forget the feel of her hand in his as he pulled her to shore. For the first time since she arrived, he wondered if maybe her presence wasn't a curse. Maybe it was the beginning of something he hadn't known he needed. As he stared out at the lake, calm now beneath the moonlight, Daniel realized that the storm had changed everything. And neither of them would ever look at the water the same way again.